Thank you, Maria. Yes, I'm going to talk about the solid fuel heaters provisions of the new policy. We have in fact had a policy for wood heaters for something like a year or so, but they actually dealt with the compliance with Australian standards of the appliances themselves. We've brought those into the new policy, but we've also brought in some requirements for excessive smoke, that is for householders actually operating their heaters in a reasonably efficient manner. And we've also, as Maria pointed out, we've now put in some requirements for firewood being sold in South Australia that it must meet this maximum content of 25% moisture by dry weight. That's been developed in concert with the firewood industry, so we're confident that that is a reasonable thing to do. Another new aspect of this policy is this concept of localised air quality objectives, which comes under clause 14 primarily. It gives the authority, that is the EPA, the head of power to declare localised objectives in an area, subject to recommendation to the Minister. And just so that people are perhaps thinking that perhaps the EPA can just unilaterally do this, that is not the case. The EPA needs to be able to establish through a procedure in clause 17 a good case, an excellent case for creating one of these areas, to say that, well, there's a good reason for doing this for a start, that it's backed up by good scientific evidence, and that the EPA has consulted with relevant organisations and considered their views. On the chance that, off chance that in fact the EPA does declare one of these things, the declaration actually overrides other provisions of the policy, which we'll talk about later when we talk about clause 18. So what are these things for? Well, first of all, it has to be made clear that the authority has not in mind any particular areas at this stage that it might declare in this way, or any particular understanding of what they might look like at this point. But the intent would be that they would be used in areas where air quality is compromised, usually through measurements that the EPA itself has been doing. And that we're talking about places where there's multiple sources. So you could talk about, for example, transport, domestic, industrial, shipping, and where there's mixed uses. For example, there are residential areas being exposed to these things. And so where we've identified particular risks, specifically health risks to communities, and where we believe that a special program or control is needed to manage those risks. We wouldn't be considering that these would be used in areas where emissions from one industrial source dominates air quality in a populated area. That's much more properly addressed through licensing. In general, one of the things that we have really introduced into this policy is to reflect the risk-based approach that the EPA is taking these days in developing conditions, for example, or in assessing proposals for development. And one of the things that we have done as compared with the old policy had a set of stack concentration limits that were mandatory, and that reflects perhaps old practice when things like the models and so on were not so well developed as they are now. And what we've now done is made stack concentrations part of the whole risk assessment process. So rather than having them as mandatory one-size-fits-all approaches. We've gone for a non-mandatory approach. Part of that reflects the fact that some industries, and some quite large industries, in fact had to be exempted from the old policy because they were not meeting some of these limits, and yet they weren't creating measurable environmental risks or impacts. So there was that discrepancy there between a particular regulatory requirement and the impacts that they are having out there in the environment itself at ground level. So when we're talking about risk, what do we mean? Well, we've put in a couple of schedules within the policy that give some clues as to what we mean by risk in terms of particular pollutants. For example, we've set up in Schedule 2 a list of something of the order of 130 different chemicals and materials that have recommended ground level concentrations, taken to reflect what we understand to be the level of risk involved in people being exposed to these materials. We've also set up some ground level odour criteria under Schedule 3, which similarly are related to amenity issues, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. Now, in setting these up, these numbers have generally been adapted from an old set of what we call design ground level concentrations, which were ultimately used for designing stacks and other controlled emission points. We've now brought them in and we've dropped off the design bit, so we're just calling them ground level concentration criteria, so that they apply not only when we're designing stacks, but as far as performance. And not just about stacks either, it's also to do with other types of emissions, including fugitive emissions, dust emissions, and so on. The other thing that we've done is we've brought into this policy some reference publications, which Maria has already mentioned a couple of them. They now sit on the EPA website. This one here, called Evaluation Distances for Effective Air Quality and Noise Management, have morphed from the old separation distance guidelines that the EPA used. There's a new one here called Ambient Air Quality Assessment 2016, which Dr. Shah will talk about in a few minutes. And the emission testing methodology for air pollution, which has been around now for a few years. This is a much more prescriptive document than the other two. The others provide recommendations on how we should be assessing things. So just to summarise, we're talking here about Clause 18, which refers to matters under Part 6 of the Environment Protection Act, which relates to licensing and also to assessing developments under the Development Act. Clause 18 basically requires the authority to take into account, where appropriate, the ground level concentrations in Schedule 2 already mentioned, the ground level odour criteria and the stack emissions, and these documents that I've just talked about. And there's a couple of catch-alls about any other types of air pollution or other requirements to prevent or minimise air pollution or its harmful effects. It also should be noted that elsewhere in the policy there is a requirement to make sure all reasonable and practical steps are taken to maintain any equipment that is on site that might relate to production of air pollution. So risk assessment under Clause 18, what does it actually mean? Well, in essence, it makes the licence and the licence condition the primary instrument for regulation. So a lot of it is really about applying risk approaches to developing the licence conditions so that they give a certain amount of flexibility to both the EPA and to the businesses to tailor the requirements to their business needs, as well as protecting people outside. When we talk about risk assessment, we are talking about effects on those what we call receptors. In this case, generally we're talking about people who live nearby, but there may be other environmental values such as vegetation and so on in some cases. So what are we doing? We're going to use assessments using modelling, monitoring or other tools to develop some license conditions that, for example, if a process has a stack, and not all processes do of course, you would have tailored stack concentrations appropriate to regulating emissions from the activity. That is, rather than relying on the old emission limits, we're actually saying, well, actually you can do better than that in most cases. And so using, for example, the ground level concentration criteria, we can model back and work out what the process should be emitting to make sure that it doesn't exceed those ground level concentrations. In what is sometimes a more complex case, we also can model fugitive emissions such as, for example, dust from mining and extractive industries or earth moving, and work that back to those ground level concentrations as well. We also want to make sure that people have best practice management systems in place to make sure that not only is their equipment working, but that people understand how to avoid causing off-site impacts. In what we believe to be a rare case, it may not be feasible or practical to use modelling or monitoring, and we may on those occasions use those limits, those stack limits in Schedule 4 to develop licence conditions. As I say, we believe that's a pretty rare scenario, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And just reiterating that we also use a similar process or the same process for assessing developments under the proposals under the Development Act. So just to summarise this process, the kinds of things that we need to look at to come to some kind of regulatory outcome are summarised over here. And you'll notice that this all refers to Clause 18, but one of the first things we often need to look at is, well, how far is a proposed development away from people, for example? And that's where these evaluation distances come in. And those distances are recommended for activities of typical scale and or technologies. If we find that the distance is greater than one of these recommended evaluation distances, then it's likely that the risk is going to be pretty low, and it's a fairly simple approval with appropriate conditions to get through that. If the distance falls inside one of these, and Dr. Sherrill will talk about this in a bit more detail, then we need to go through a bit more complex process. And the sorts of things we need to be thinking about are the ground level concentrations, any health indicators or endpoints that are important, any other environmental harm indicators, for example crop damage or other vegetation damage, the ground level odour criteria, so if people are going to be stunk out by this, we don't want that to happen. Also, we don't want them to be enveloped in a dust cloud. So, and often complaints and community outrage are pretty important aspects of what we deal with. And last but not least, we need to take into account the fact that there are some economic or business constraints that need to be looked at. And the kind of tools we use occur within this pink circle here. We've already mentioned atmospheric modelling or monitoring. You can do stack testing or area source measurements. You need to understand how close receptors are, that is generally people. The methodologies, for example, the stack testing and other methodologies that are used, economic factors, community impacts and responses, and this one here, declared local air quality objectives. The other scenarios, the three scenarios we can talk about are obviously the risk level is okay without doing very much, in which case you get a basic licence or approval. It might well be that the company is able to demonstrate effective controls and systems that give acceptable risk levels. In which case, clearly any licence or approval will reflect those kinds of controls that are being put in place. We talk about this tailored stack emission limits, using technology that we use this term here, BATIA, which is best available technology economically achievable. Wonderful for acronym lovers. But also we can't always control all emissions. For example, the fugitive or dust emissions need to be managed. And often we would be requiring dust management plans or trigger and response plans, pardon me, to make sure that activities don't have off-site impacts. And often this will apply very much to things like mining operations or extractive industries that are in close proximity to communities. And we would also more and more be asking companies to undertake community engagement programs. Now, if you get a situation where the risk is unacceptable and uncontrollable at reasonable cost, then the likelihood is that there will be a refusal. Although there's always the opportunity to go back into the system, try another process or different controls, and perhaps get to this sort of state. That very rare occasion that I talk about where this scenario doesn't quite work, we would use comparative assessment with other plants, for example, and we may give a license or approval that uses, for example, those stack concentration limits, but obviously some other things that would be required under license. But our belief here is that this is a pretty unlikely scenario, that virtually all proposals that we wind up with tend to follow this general path here. So I'll hand over now to Dr. Shah, I think, to talk about risk assessment.